Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Ozark Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1876. Those who traveled through the remote valleys of the Missouri Ozarks often spoke of the strange sense of being watched. It wasn't the usual feeling that comes from wild animals or hidden hunters. No, this was different. A prickling awareness that something ancient resided in these hills, something that predated the settlers who had carved out homesteads in the wilderness after the Civil War. Among the scattered communities that dotted the Ozarks landscape, none was more isolated than Hollow Creek, a small settlement nestled in a valley between limestone bluffs, roughly 20 miles southeast of what is now Springfield. The settlement consisted of only 6 cabins, built from local timber and spaced far enough apart that neighbors couldn't easily observe each other's daily activities. This isolation was intentional. Most who settled there had reasons to avoid the scrutiny of more populated areas. The prominent family in Hollow Creek was the Ambrose clan, led by matriarch Millicent Ambrose. A woman of uncommon height with piercing gray eyes, she had arrived from Kentucky with her 3 adult sons sometime in the early 1860s during the chaos of the war. They established themselves quickly, building the largest home in the settlement and acquiring what passed for wealth in such a remote location. Local accounts describe Millicent Ambrose as a woman of contradictions. Stern yet gracious, reserved yet surprisingly knowledgeable about matters that extended far beyond the boundaries of Hollow Creek. She was known for her unusual garden, which contained herbs and plants not typical to the region. When neighboring families fell ill, she often appeared with strange-smelling tinctures and teas that, according to various testimonies recorded in an 1887 journal kept by a traveling doctor, seemed to alleviate symptoms with surprising speed. The settlement maintained minimal contact with the outside world. Every few months, one of the Ambrose sons would make the journey to Springfield for supplies and to collect any mail that might have arrived for Hollow Creek's residents. It was a journey that took 3 days in good weather, longer when the rains came and turned the narrow dirt trails to mud. Records from the Springfield Mercantile show that the eldest Ambrose son, Harrison, made these supply runs with clockwork regularity. The ledgers, still preserved in the Missouri State Archives, show purchases typical of frontier households: flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition, tools, fabric, but they also show more unusual items: rare herbs, specialized glass containers, unusual minerals, and books ordered from as far away as Boston and New Orleans. The proprietor of the Mercantile, Samuel Whitaker, noted in his personal journal that Harrison Ambrose always paid in gold coins of Spanish origin, rather than the more common currency or barter arrangements used by most customers from remote settlements. The middle son, Thaddeus, was known for his craftsmanship. Several families in Hollow Creek lived in cabins he had helped construct, and his skill with woodworking was apparently exceptional. A writing desk attributed to Thaddeus Ambrose was discovered in a Springfield antique shop in 1922 and now resides in a private collection. Experts who have examined it note the unusual symbols carved subtly into its frame, symbols similar to those found in certain Appalachian folk traditions associated with protection and binding. The youngest son, Caleb, was perhaps the most enigmatic of the family. Few accounts of him exist in the historical record, beyond brief mentions. Those who did recall him described a slender, quiet man who rarely spoke but watched everything with the same intense gaze as his mother. Several accounts mention his apparent gift with animals. Even the most skittish horses would calm at his touch, and wild creatures seemingly showed no fear of him. One neighbor, Elijah Reed, claimed in an 1875 letter to his cousin that he once witnessed Caleb Ambrose standing perfectly still in a clearing, surrounded by forest creatures that approached him without fear. as if they recognized him as one of their own kind, or perhaps something they instinctively knew not to fear. In the autumn of 1876, something changed in Hollow Creek. According to accounts later collected by a journalist for the Springfield Monitor, Millicent Ambrose began extending invitations to travelers who passed near the settlement. This was unusual enough to cause comment among the other families. The Ambroses had never shown interest in hosting visitors before. The first documented invitation occurred in late September. A fur trapper named Jeremiah Walsh reported encountering Millicent Ambrose on the trail leading toward Hollow Creek. According to Walsh's account, given to a tavern keeper in Springfield, the woman approached him directly, standing in the middle of the path as if she had been waiting specifically for him. "She was the strangest woman I ever laid eyes on," Walsh was quoted as saying, "tall as any man, with this way of looking at you like she was reading something written on the back of your skull. She invited me to stay at her home, said she had a fine meal prepared, and that the coming storm would make travel dangerous." Walsh declined the invitation, claiming he needed to reach Springfield before nightfall. He later reported feeling an overwhelming sense of relief as he rode away, though he couldn't explain why. The storm Millicent had predicted arrived precisely as she had warned, but Walsh pushed through, arriving in Springfield soaked, but, in his words, somehow fortunate. Throughout October and November of 1876, at least 7 travelers reported similar encounters. Millicent Ambrose, sometimes accompanied by one of her sons, would appear on the trail surrounding Hollow Creek, extending seemingly hospitable invitations to weary travelers. Most declined, citing various reasons for needing to continue their journeys. Those who did were never seen or heard from again. The second documented encounter involved a cattle buyer named Frederick Simmons, who was returning to Springfield after visiting farms further south. Simmons reported meeting Millicent Ambrose at a fork in the trail on October 3, 1876. Like Walsh, he described her as appearing suddenly, as if she had materialized from the surrounding forest. According to his account, given to Marshall Thornton and recorded in the lawman's official logbook, Millicent informed him that the northern fork he had intended to take had been washed out by recent rains, and invited him to stay at her home until the trail was passable again. Simmons, unlike Walsh, initially considered accepting the invitation. He described experiencing a strong desire to follow Millicent, despite having pressing business in Springfield. "It was the strangest sensation," he later told Marshall Thornton, "like being pulled by an invisible rope. I found myself dismounting and taking a step toward her before I even realized what I was doing." What stopped him, according to his account, was the sudden and inexplicable behavior of his horse, which became agitated, rearing and pulling against its reins, until Simmons was forced to remount to prevent it from bolting. Millicent Ambrose reportedly showed no disappointment at his refusal. She just smiled and said, "Another time, perhaps. The invitation remains open." Then she turned and walked into the trees. "I swear to you, Marshal, I looked away for just a moment to calm my horse, and when I looked back, she was gone. Vanished, like she'd never been there at all." Simmons chose the southern fork, adding considerable distance to his journey, but arrived safely in Springfield the following day. Upon investigating his claim about the northern trail, Marshall Thornton found that it was perfectly passable, with no sign of any washout or obstruction. The third encounter, on October 11th, involved a young woman named Catherine Bishop traveling with her elderly father from their homestead to seek medical attention in Springfield. They encountered Millicent Ambrose at dusk as they were considering making camp for the night. According to Catherine's subsequent statement, Millicent appeared from behind a large oak tree, startling both travelers. "She seemed to know my father's condition without being told," Catherine reported. "She mentioned that his breathing had been troubling him and offered a remedy if we would accompany her to her home. She spoke with such authority and certainty that I nearly agreed, particularly when she said the treatment couldn't be administered on the trail, but required specific preparations at her house." What deterred Catherine was not any suspicion of Millicent herself, but rather an observation about the surrounding forest. As she spoke, I noticed the woods had fallen completely silent. No birds, no insects, not even the wind in the leaves. It was as if everything around us was holding its breath, waiting. That unnatural silence frightened me more than anything else. Catherine politely declined the invitation, explaining that her father's condition required a doctor's care in Springfield. Millicent accepted this explanation without protest, but offered a small leather pouch containing dried herbs. "For his breathing," she reportedly said, "brew it as a tea when you make camp tonight. It won't cure him, but it will ease his discomfort until you reach the doctor." Catherine accepted the pouch, but admitted to Marshal Thornton that she discarded it as soon as Millicent Ambrose was out of sight, feeling it was somehow dangerous, though I couldn't say why. She and her father reached Springfield the next day, where her father received treatment for what was diagnosed as pneumonia. He recovered fully. The pattern established by these early encounters continued throughout October and into November. Millicent Ambrose would appear to travelers on or near the trail surrounding Hollow Creek, always with an invitation to visit her home, often accompanied by some knowledge of the traveler's situation that she seemingly shouldn't have possessed. Those who declined reported feelings ranging from relief to outright fear, along with observations of unusual silences or strange behaviors from animals or the natural environment during the encounters. By November, word of these encounters had spread among the residents of Springfield and the surrounding settlements. Most dismissed them as typical frontier tall tales, perhaps exaggerated accounts of meetings with an eccentric but harmless old woman. Others, particularly those with roots in Appalachian traditions, recognized more sinister implications in the details. A traveling preacher named Ezekiel Morgan, who visited Springfield in mid-November, reportedly warned his congregation about invitations extended by those who dwell in the hidden places, advising that such offers should always be declined, regardless of how reasonable or necessary they might seem. Morgan's sermon, recounted in several personal journals and letters from the period, made no specific mention of Millicent Ambrose or Hollow Creek, but the parallels were clear to those familiar with the recent accounts. An invitation freely given must be freely accepted or declined, Morgan was quoted as saying. But once accepted, it forms a bond that cannot be broken by mortal means. Consider carefully who you allow to extend their hospitality to you, for in accepting, you place yourself under their authority in ways you may not comprehend until it is too late to reconsider. Despite these warnings, not everyone who encountered Millicent Ambrose during this period declined her invitation. Records indicate that at least 7 individuals accepted and subsequently disappeared. Their identities, pieced together from missing persons reports filed with Marshal Thornton's office and from accounts given by friends, family members, and traveling companions, paint a troubling picture. The first known person to accept Millicent's invitation was Jonathan Mercer, a geologist conducting surveys for a mining company. Mercer had been mapping potential mineral deposits throughout the Ozarks and was last seen on October 5, 1876, when he separated from his assistant to investigate an unusual rock formation near Hollow Creek. His assistant reported that Mercer had instructed him to continue to their next designated survey point, saying he would catch up by nightfall. When Mercer failed to appear by the following morning, the assistant returned to search for him, but found no trace. The second was Abigail Warren, a widow traveling to live with her sister after the death of her husband. The driver of the wagon train she had been traveling with reported that Mrs. Warren had complained of illness as they passed near Hollow Creek on October 9th. When a woman approached offering assistance and shelter, the wagon master was relieved to have one less sick passenger to worry about, and continued on with the understanding that Mrs. Warren would rejoin them in Springfield after recovering. She never arrived at her sister's home, and subsequent inquiries to Hollow Creek went unanswered. The third was Dr. Samuel Hollister, a physician and amateur botanist, who had expressed interest in documenting the medicinal plants of the Ozarks. Dr. Hollister had corresponded with colleagues about rumors of unusual flora in the region surrounding Hollow Creek and had set out specifically to investigate these claims in mid-October. His last letter, dated October 15th and mailed from a settlement one day's journey from Hollow Creek, mentioned his excitement about meeting a local healer who had promised to show him rare specimens not documented in any existing botanical reference. The fourth and fifth were a married couple, Robert and Emily Cartwright, traveling from St. Louis to visit family in Arkansas. They were last seen on October 23rd, when they stopped at a trading post approximately 15 miles from Hollow Creek to rest their horses. The proprietor of the trading post later told Marshal Thornton that the couple had mentioned meeting a striking woman on the road who had invited them to stay at her home, which would shorten their journey by allowing them to bypass a difficult section of trail. The Cartwrights thought it a stroke of good fortune and planned to accept the offer when they encountered the woman again, which she had assured them would happen later that day. The sixth was Father Thomas Donovan, a Catholic priest traveling between parish missions. His disappearance was perhaps the most thoroughly documented, as he had kept a detailed journal of his travels, which was found with his abandoned horse and belongings on November 2nd. The final entry, dated October 29th, described his encounter with a remarkable woman of unusual presence, who had invited him to visit her settlement to minister to residents who had not seen a priest in many years. Father Donovan wrote of his decision to accompany her, seeing it as his spiritual duty, despite what he described as a curious reluctance that I can only attribute to physical fatigue rather than any spiritual warning. The seventh and final documented disappearance before the authorities became involved was that of Luther Hammond, a retired soldier who had fought for the Union Army during the Civil War. Hammond was traveling to Springfield to collect his military pension and was last seen on November 7th. A hunting party found his campsite 3 days later, with all his belongings intact, but no sign of Hammond himself. The only unusual element was a note written on a page torn from Hammond's small personal Bible, which read simply, "Met a lady who knows of my service at Shiloh, going to her home for supper and conversation about the old days. Back by morning." He never returned. By December, rumors began circulating in Springfield about the disappearances. A mail carrier who serviced the remote settlements reported that several expected letters and packages had accumulated for individuals who never came to claim them. These individuals had all been documented as traveling through the region surrounding Hollow Creek. The peculiar pattern caught the attention of Marshal Silas Thornton, a veteran of the Civil War who had established himself as Springfield's primary law enforcement officer. According to records from his office, Thornton had received reports of at least 5 missing persons who had last been seen traveling in the vicinity of Hollow Creek. The common thread in all cases was their intended travel route through that isolated valley. What made the pattern particularly troubling to Thornton was that these disappearances cut across all social boundaries. The missing included men and women, young and old, educated professionals and simple travelers, the religious and the secular. The only commonality, besides their route through the Hollow Creek area, was that each had apparently accepted an invitation from a woman matching Millicent Ambrose's description. On December 12, 1876, Marshal Thornton organized a small group of deputies to investigate the disappearances. The group consisted of Thornton himself, 3 deputies, James Hargrove, William Mitchell, and Thomas Wills, and a local guide named Ellis Jackson, who was familiar with the remote trails of the Ozarks. They departed Springfield on horseback, expecting to reach Hollow Creek within 2 days. What transpired during that expedition is primarily documented through the recovered journal of Deputy James Hargrove, which was found 3 months later by hunters approximately 5 miles from Hollow Creek. The journal's final entries paint a disturbing picture of what the law enforcement party encountered. December 13, 1876. The weather has turned against us. Snow began falling at midday, and the temperature has dropped considerably. Thornton insists we press on, despite the guide's suggestion that we make camp and wait out the storm. There's something driving the marshal forward that goes beyond professional duty. When I asked him about his urgency, he merely stated that every day we delay may cost another life. We should reach Hollow Creek by tomorrow afternoon, if the weather permits. The guide, Jackson, seems increasingly reluctant as we draw closer to our destination. When pressed, he admitted that his own father had warned him to avoid the area around Hollow Creek, calling it a place where the boundaries thin. I'm not certain what he meant by this, and he would not elaborate further. Thornton dismissed it as superstitious nonsense, but I noticed he checked his weapon shortly afterward, something he's done with increasing frequency as we've progressed deeper into these mountains. The forest here feels different from any I've traveled through before. The trees grow in unusual patterns, often twisted and contorted in ways that seem to defy natural growth. Jackson says it's from the harsh winds that blow through these valleys, but I've seen trees shaped by wind before, and these seem deliberate somehow, as if positioned by some intelligence. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, convinced we're being observed, though I've spotted no sign of any human presence since we left the main road yesterday morning. The next entry is significantly longer and was clearly written in haste, the handwriting becoming increasingly erratic as it progresses. December 14th. Something is wrong here. We arrived at Hollow Creek shortly after noon to find the settlement apparently deserted. No smoke from chimneys despite the bitter cold. No sounds of livestock. The cabins stand empty, yet show no signs of hurried departure. Food still in larders, clothing in wardrobes. The Ambrose house stands on the hill overlooking the others, larger, better constructed. Marshal Thornton ordered a thorough search of all buildings. In the Ambrose cellar, we discovered a room hidden behind a false wall. Inside, we found, I struggle to describe it, tables covered with strange instruments, jars containing substances none of us could identify, books written in languages none of us recognized, and maps. Dozens of maps with markings concentrated in 7 specific locations throughout the Ozarks. Thornton became agitated upon seeing these maps, claiming they matched the locations of the recent disappearances. As we were discussing what to do next, Jackson called from outside. He'd found tracks leading away from the settlement into the forest, multiple sets heading toward what the guide calls Widow's Peak. We followed the tracks through deepening snow. They led directly, without deviation, as if those who made them had a clear destination in mind and no hesitation about reaching it. Thornton commented that there were at least a dozen distinct sets of footprints, more than could be accounted for by the residents of Hollow Creek alone. I realized then that we might be following the trail of the missing persons as well. The tracks led to a clearing at the base of Widow's Peak, a distinctive rock formation that Jackson says is named for its shape, like a woman in mourning, head bowed beneath a veil. The resemblance is unsettling, particularly in the fading light of this winter afternoon. In the clearing we found evidence of recent activity, a large fire pit, now cold, surrounded by a circle of stones placed with mathematical precision. Around this circle, smaller objects had been arranged. Personal items that Thornton believes may have belonged to the missing travelers, a pocket watch, a woman's bonnet, a military medal that appears to be from the Union Army, a doctor's bag, a priest's rosary. Jackson refused to step into the circle of stones, claiming that to do so would be to accept the invitation. Thornton ordered Wills to collect the personal items as evidence, but as he reached for the pocket watch, something extraordinary occurred. We heard singing coming from the forest surrounding the clearing, a woman's voice, though unlike any singing I've ever heard. The words were not in English, nor in any language I recognize, though I've heard French, Spanish, and several Indian dialects in my travels. This was something older, something that seemed to resonate not just in my ears, but in my bones. The effect on our party was immediate and disturbing. Wills froze with his hand outstretched toward the watch. Jackson began trembling uncontrollably, muttering what sounded like prayers. Mitchell drew his pistol but seemed unable to decide where to aim it. And Thornton. The marshal stood perfectly still, his expression one of recognition, and something I can only describe as hunger, as if he were hearing something he had been waiting for his entire life. Then she appeared at the edge of the clearing, Millicent Ambrose, exactly as described by the witnesses. Tall, gray-eyed, watching us with an expression of mild curiosity, as if our presence was unexpected, but not unwelcome. She wore a dress of dark material, oddly cut, and adorned with symbols similar to those we had seen on the maps in her cellar. Around her neck hung a pendant that caught what little light remained in the day and seemed to amplify it, casting prismatic patterns across the snow. "You've come earlier than expected," she said, her voice carrying clearly, despite the softness with which she spoke. "But perhaps that's for the best. The alignment approaches, and we still have one doorway without its key." Thornton drew his pistol, demanded to know what had happened to the missing travelers. She smiled at him then, and I will never forget that smile, not mocking or cruel, but knowing, as if she recognized something in Thornton that he himself did not yet understand. "They accepted my invitation," she replied, "as did you, long ago, though you've forgotten. The pattern requires 7, Marshal, 7 doors, 7 keys. You were to be the 7th, but you strayed from the path. No matter. You've returned now, and you've brought alternatives with you." She looked at each of us in turn, her gaze lingering longest on me. "Will you accept the invitation freely given? Will you join the journey that transcends the boundaries you've always known?" Thornton fired a warning shot into the air, the sound shockingly loud in the hushed forest. He ordered her to surrender herself for questioning regarding the missing persons. She showed no reaction to the gunshot, not even a flinch. Instead, she turned and walked back into the forest, her movements fluid and unhurried. Thornton and Wills immediately went after her. I called for them to wait, to stay together, but they either didn't hear or chose to ignore me. Mitchell stayed with Jackson, who seemed on the verge of collapse. "I'm going now to join the marshal and Wills. The light is failing rapidly, and I fear losing them in these woods as night falls. If we haven't returned by morning, Mitchell will take this journal back to Springfield as evidence of what we found." The final entry is dated the same day, but was evidently written hours later in near darkness, judging by the quality of the handwriting. "Night has fallen completely now. I've been searching for hours without finding any trace of Thornton or Wills. The forest seems to shift around me, landmarks appearing and disappearing, trails leading in circles despite my best efforts to maintain direction. The singing continues, sometimes seemingly just ahead, other times behind me or to either side. I've discharged my pistol twice, hoping Thornton or Wills might hear and respond, but there has been no answering shot. I've decided to return to the clearing. Perhaps Mitchell and Jackson are still there, or perhaps Thornton and Wills have returned by a different route. The temperature continues to drop, and I do not relish the thought of spending the night alone in these woods. Something is following me. I hear movement in the underbrush, too deliberate for an animal, too inconsistent for a human tracker. When I turn to look, there is nothing visible, yet the sense of being observed is overwhelming. The singing has stopped, replaced by what sounds like whispering in the same strange language, coming from all directions at once. I can see the clearing ahead, illuminated by moonlight reflecting off the snow. There's no sign of Mitchell or Jackson, but the circle of stones is still there, and within it. I can't be certain, but it appears that the objects we found earlier have been arranged differently, forming a pattern on the ground that matches the one on Millicent Ambrose's maps. I hear footsteps behind me now, approaching steadily. I fear it may be too late to... The journal entry ends abruptly mid-sentence, with a long, erratic pen stroke trailing off the page, as if Hargrove's hand had been suddenly jerked away. Deputy Hargrove never returned to Springfield. Neither did Marshal Thornton or any other member of the expedition. When no word came back after 5 days, a larger posse was organized, consisting of 15 armed men led by Springfield's mayor, Josiah Bennett. They reached Hollow Creek on December 22, 1876, only to find the settlement completely abandoned, not just of people, but of nearly all evidence that anyone had ever lived there. According to the official report filed with the Territorial Governor's Office, the buildings of Hollow Creek remained standing, but had been stripped of almost all contents. No personal belongings, no furniture, no tools or implements remained. The only exception was the cellar of the Ambrose house, where the posse found the hidden room described in Hargrove's journal. But unlike his description, the room was empty save for a single item, a hand-drawn invitation card placed in the center of the floor. The card, preserved now in the archives of the Missouri Historical Society, contains a simple message written in elegant script: "Your presence is requested." The journey continues. It is signed with an unusual symbol that folklore experts have since identified as a variation of sigils commonly associated with certain Appalachian folk traditions that some settlers brought with them to the Ozarks. The posse followed tracks leading from the settlement to Widow's Peak, where they discovered the stone circle described in Hargrove's journal. The fire pit at the center contained ashes, which upon closer inspection contained small fragments of bone, whether human or animal could not be determined with the forensic methods available at the time. The personal items mentioned in the journal were gone. Despite an extensive search of the surrounding area, no trace was ever found of Marshall Thornton, his deputies, or their guide. Nor was any evidence discovered regarding the fate of the original Hollow Creek settlers or the travelers who had disappeared over the preceding months. The search party reported one additional detail not included in the official record, but mentioned in several personal accounts that have survived. According to these sources, as the posse prepared to leave Widow's Peak, several men claimed to hear singing coming from the forest, a woman's voice, using words from no known language. Mayor Bennett ordered an immediate return to Springfield, refusing to allow any member of the party to investigate the sound. One member of the posse, a blacksmith named Jeremiah Thorne, apparently lingered behind the others, drawn by curiosity about the singing. According to his companions, Thorne called out that he could see someone moving among the trees and rode off to investigate despite their warnings. He never returned to Springfield, becoming the final documented disappearance connected to Hollow Creek and Millicent Ambrose. In January 1877, a formal investigation was launched by the territorial authorities. Over the course of 6 months, investigators interviewed dozens of witnesses, including the friends and families of the missing travelers, residents of neighboring settlements, and travelers who had declined Millicent Ambrose's invitations. What emerged was a disturbing pattern reaching back further than initially suspected. Records from as early as 1871 indicated travelers going missing in the Ozarks, particularly along the routes surrounding Hollow Creek. In most cases, the disappearances had been attributed to the natural dangers of the region: harsh weather, treacherous terrain, wild animals, or occasionally banditry. But when investigators mapped these disappearances, they discovered a pattern matching the markings found on the maps in the Ambrose cellar. 7 locations throughout the Ozarks, forming a pattern that one investigator, a man with knowledge of geometric principles, claimed formed a perfect 7-pointed star when connected. The investigation also uncovered earlier reports of unusual phenomena at these 7 locations. Local hunters spoke of game animals avoiding certain clearings or rock formations without apparent reason. Prospectors told of compass needles spinning wildly at specific spots, making navigation impossible. Several accounts described unusual acoustic properties, sounds carrying over impossible distances, or voices seeming to emanate from solid rock faces. Even more disturbing were the accounts collected from elderly residents of the region, particularly those whose families had lived in the Ozarks for generations. They spoke of old stories predating white settlement about certain locations in the mountains that the indigenous peoples had considered sacred or forbidden. Places where the boundary between this world and another was said to be thinner. One account, provided by an elderly woman of mixed Cherokee and European descent, described ancient warnings about doors that open when the stars align. She claimed her grandmother had spoken of 7 such doors scattered throughout the mountains, and of an old ritual that required 7 keys to unlock them all. When shown the symbol from the invitation card found in the Ambrose cellar, the woman became visibly distressed. According to the interview transcript, she made the sign of the cross, refused to continue the conversation, and would only say, "That's her mark, the one who waits and watches, the one who extends the invitation." Another elderly informant, a man who had trapped and hunted in the Ozarks since the 1820s, provided a more detailed account. He claimed that long before white settlers arrived, the Cherokee and other tribes had avoided certain locations in the mountains, believing them to be doorways to what they called the other world. According to his story, these doorways remained closed most of the time, but could be opened during specific celestial alignments if the proper offerings were made. They said there was a woman who knew how to open the doors, the old trapper told investigators. Not a human woman, but something that took a woman's shape when it wanted to walk among people. They called her the Inviter in their language, and they said she appeared to those who had something she needed, some quality or essence that could serve as a key to one of the doors. She would extend an invitation, and those who accepted were never seen again in this world. When asked if he believed these stories, the trapper reportedly laughed. Believed them enough to stay away from those places they pointed out. And I'm still here, aren't I? Can't say the same for some others I knew who thought the old stories were just superstition. The official investigation was closed in July 1877 with no definitive conclusions. The disappearances were attributed to unknown causes, possibly criminal in nature, and the Hollow Creek settlement was officially stricken from territorial maps. The area was designated as unsuitable for settlement due to dangerous terrain and unstable ground conditions. The 7 locations identified in the Ambrose maps were similarly marked as hazardous, with warnings posted against camping or lingering in their vicinity. Unofficial investigations continued for years afterward, driven by relatives of the missing and by a few persistent journalists and amateur sleuths. Their findings, while never officially recognized, suggest dimensions to the case that the authorities were unwilling or unable to address. In 1882, a geological survey team working in the area near where Hollow Creek had stood reported unusual findings. The entire valley showed signs of dramatic change. What had once been relatively flat terrain now featured numerous sinkholes and unusual rock formations that local experts insisted had not been present before. When one member of the survey team attempted to explore one of the larger sinkholes, he reported hearing what sounded like voices conversing at a great distance. The team abandoned their survey shortly thereafter. Their official report attributed the geological changes to natural subsidence following heavy rainfall. But private correspondence between team members, discovered in a university archive in 1952, tells a different story. In a letter to a colleague, the lead geologist wrote, "What we observed defies scientific explanation. The formations appear to have been pushed up from below, rather than collapsing inward as would be expected with typical karst topography." More disturbing still is that several of these formations bear a striking resemblance to the symbols found on that invitation card you showed me from the Historical Society's collection. I cannot shake the feeling that we were looking at a message written in stone, meant for someone or something other than human eyes. In 1887, a journalist named Victor Marsh published a series of articles about the Hollow Creek incident in a St. Louis newspaper. Marsh had spent several months in the Ozarks interviewing witnesses and collecting local folklore related to Millicent Ambrose and her family. His most significant finding came from church records in a small Kentucky town, which documented the death of a Millicent Ambrose in 1857, 4 years before she allegedly appeared in the Ozarks. According to these records, Millicent Ambrose had been a respected healer and midwife in her Kentucky community until accusations of unorthodox practices led to her ostracization. She died of pneumonia during the winter of 1857 and was buried in the local cemetery. When Marsh had the grave exhumed, with proper permissions from local authorities, he found the coffin empty. Further investigation revealed that Millicent Ambrose had 3 sons whose descriptions matched those of the young men who had accompanied the Millicent Ambrose of Hollow Creek. Church records indicated that all 3 had died in a house fire in 1857, shortly after their mother's death. Their graves, when examined, were also empty. What Marsh could not explain, and what particularly disturbed him, was that he found several eyewitnesses who claimed to have known Millicent Ambrose and her sons in Kentucky, and who insisted that the family bore little physical resemblance to the descriptions of the Hollow Creek Ambroses. The Kentucky Millicent was described as short, plump, and brown-eyed, with sons who were similarly stocky in build. How or why individuals claiming to be the Ambrose family but bearing no physical resemblance to them would assume their identities remained a mystery. Perhaps the most disturbing account comes from a journal discovered in 1892 among the personal effects of a deceased Springfield merchant. The merchant, Harold Whitfield, had apparently encountered Millicent Ambrose on the road to Hollow Creek in October 1876. Unlike other travelers, he had accepted her invitation, but claimed to have fled during the night after witnessing what he described as a communion that defied natural law. Whitfield's journal entry, dated October 23, 1876, describes being led to the Stone Circle at Widow's Peak, where other travelers who had accepted the invitation were gathered. He writes of a ceremony led by Millicent, involving the 7 locations marked on the maps. According to Whitfield, Millicent explained that each location contained a doorway that could be opened with the proper key. Not a physical key, but a living one. She spoke of the 7 travelers she had chosen, how each possessed a quality needed to unlock one of the 7 doors, Whitfield wrote. She called it the alignment, and promised that those who participated would transcend the limitations of mortal existence. I watched as she placed her hands on Mr. Collins, the first chosen, and spoke words in a language I've never heard before. His eyes changed somehow, still physically the same, but as if someone else now looked out from behind them. He smiled in a manner identical to hers. That's when I knew I had to escape. Whitfield claimed to have slipped away while the others were distracted by the ceremony, fleeing through the forest until he reached the main road. He immediately returned to Springfield, sold his business, and relocated to St. Louis, never returning to the Ozarks. His journal ends with a warning. If you ever find yourself on a lonely road in those mountains and encounter a tall woman with gray eyes who offers you shelter, decline respectfully but firmly, then run. Run until you can no longer hear the echo of her voice in your head. For her invitation leads to places from which there is no return. Whitfield died 6 months after writing this account, from what his doctor described as rapid aging of unknown cause. According to friends who saw him in his final weeks, Whitfield had aged decades in a matter of months, his hair turning white, his skin developing the deep wrinkles of extreme old age, despite being only 43 at the time of his death. In his delirium near the end, he reportedly spoke of hearing singing outside his window every night, growing louder as his condition deteriorated. Throughout the late 19th century, occasional reports surfaced of travelers encountering a tall, gray-eyed woman on remote trails in the Ozarks, always with an invitation to visit her home. Those who documented these encounters had all declined the invitation and returned safely to tell their stories. The frequency of these reports diminished gradually, with the last credible account recorded in 1914. In 1963, a team of archaeologists from the University of Missouri attempted to locate the site of Hollow Creek and Widow's Peak, using the historical records as guides. Despite extensive surveys of the area, they were unable to find any evidence that a settlement had ever existed there. The landscape itself seemed to have changed significantly from the descriptions in the historical accounts, with no valley matching the one where Hollow Creek was said to have stood. What they did find, however, was a series of unusual rock formations at 7 locations throughout the Ozarks, locations that, when mapped, formed the same 7-pointed star pattern described in the 1877 investigation. At each location, they discovered similar petroglyphs carved into the rock, symbols that experts in indigenous art couldn't attribute to any known Native American culture from the region. The lead archaeologist noted in his report that all 7 locations featured unusually high levels of magnetic anomalies that interfered with their equipment. He also documented reports from team members of auditory hallucinations while working at these sites, specifically the sound of a woman singing in the distance, though no source could ever be identified. The team's findings were published in a small academic journal in 1965, but received little attention outside specialized circles. The lead archaeologist left academia shortly afterward, reportedly telling colleagues that some aspects of history were better left unexcavated. One of the graduate students who participated in that expedition later became a respected anthropologist specializing in Ozark folklore. Dr. Elizabeth Chambers published numerous papers on the traditions and beliefs of the region, but steadfastly refused to discuss the 1963 expedition or her experiences at the 7 sites. In a rare comment on the subject made during a conference in 1982, she said only, "Some invitations should never be accepted, no matter how appealing they might seem. The price of admission is higher than most would be willing to pay if they understood what was being asked of them." When pressed for clarification, Dr. Chambers abruptly ended the interview. She retired from academic life the following year and moved to a remote cabin in northern Maine, where she had no telephone and accepted no visitors until her death in 1997. Another member of that expedition, photographer Richard Keller, was less reticent about his experiences. In a memoir published in 1978, he described what happened when the team investigated the 7th site, located near what is now Table Rock Lake. "We arrived late in the afternoon, with perhaps 2 hours of daylight remaining. The formation was similar to the others we documented, a circular arrangement of limestone blocks, too precisely positioned to be natural, surrounding a central stone that resembled an altar of some kind. As at the previous sites, we found petroglyphs on the stones, those same unintelligible symbols that had become familiar to us over the course of the expedition. I was setting up my camera equipment when I heard it, singing, soft but clear, coming from the forest to the east of our position. Dr. Miller, the lead archaeologist, immediately ordered everyone to return to the vehicles. There was something in his voice I'd never heard before, pure fear, undisguised and urgent. But before we could comply, she stepped into the clearing. I can describe her objectively. Tall, with unusual gray eyes, wearing clothing that seemed oddly out of place, both in style and material. But such a description fails to convey the impact of her presence. It was as if the air around her vibrated at a different frequency than the rest of the world. She looked directly at each of us in turn, smiling slightly, and then spoke. I don't recall her exact words, but the essence was an invitation to join her, to learn the secrets of the 7 doors. Dr. Miller shouted for everyone to leave immediately, not to look at her or respond in any way. Most of us obeyed, but one of the graduate students, I won't name him out of respect for his family, hesitated. I saw him take a step toward her before Dr. Miller physically grabbed him and dragged him back to the jeep. As we drove away, I looked back and saw the woman still standing by the stone circle, watching us depart with that same slight smile, as if our refusal was merely a temporary setback in some much longer game. Keller claimed that the team member who had nearly accepted the invitation was Dr. Chambers, though this contradicts other accounts that suggest the individual was male. Regardless of the discrepancy, Keller's memoir corroborates the persistent motif of an invitation extended and the apparent danger of accepting it. To this day, the area where Hollow Creek supposedly stood remains largely uninhabited. Local residents avoid it, citing reasons ranging from poor soil to bad feelings. Park rangers responsible for the general region report occasional distress calls from hikers who become disoriented in the area, claiming to have been invited to follow trails that don't appear on any official maps. A ranger who has worked in the Ozarks for over 30 years and who requested anonymity when interviewed for this account described a recurring pattern of incidents. Every few years, usually during the autumn months, we'll get a surge of unusual reports from hikers in that section of the park. They describe meeting a woman on the trail who offers to show them a shortcut or a scenic view not on the official maps. Most decline and continue on their way without incident. But occasionally, someone accepts. Those are the ones we end up searching for, and we don't always find them. The most recent case was in 2008, a graduate student researching Ozark folklore. Ironically enough, he went hiking alone, telling his advisor he wanted to visit some of the locations mentioned in the old accounts of the Hollow Creek incident. 3 days later, his car was still in the trailhead parking lot, with no sign of him on any of the established trails. We organized a search, brought in dogs, even used helicopters, with thermal imaging. Nothing. 4 months later, a hunter found his backpack hanging from a tree branch about 20 miles from where he'd started his hike, in an area with no marked trails. Inside was his journal, with entries describing his encounter with a tall woman with unusual gray eyes, who had offered to show him the site of Hollow Creek. The final entry just said, "I've accepted her invitation." The journey continues. We never found his body. Most telling, perhaps, is the local custom that has persisted for generations among those who live in the Ozarks. When traveling the back roads and trails, particularly as evening approaches, it is considered prudent to loudly decline any invitations from strangers encountered along the way, regardless of how reasonable or hospitable the offer might seem. An invitation declined cannot be held against you, goes the local saying, but an invitation accepted binds you to its terms, seen and unseen. And if one happens to encounter a tall woman with gray eyes standing alone on the path, the advice passed down through generations is simple: turn around, take another route. No destination is worth the risk of accepting her hospitality. For the records show that while many declined Millicent Ambrose's invitation, those who accepted were never seen again in this world. Whatever journey they embarked upon that autumn of 1876 continues still, beyond the boundaries of what we know, or perhaps wish to know. A local historian who has studied the Hollow Creek incident for decades offers this perspective. What makes this case so enduring, so unsettling, is that it plays on one of our most fundamental social customs, the extension and acceptance of hospitality. In normal circumstances, declining an invitation might be considered rude, but accepting one creates a bond between host and guest, a mutual obligation. The Hollow Creek story subverts this by suggesting that some invitations carry consequences beyond our understanding, that acceptance might bind us to terms we never agreed to because we couldn't comprehend them. There's a final curious epilogue to this account. In 1952, during renovation of the old courthouse in Springfield, workers discovered a sealed metal box hidden within a wall cavity. Inside was a letter written by Mayor Josiah Bennett, dated December 30th, 1876, just days after the posse's return from Hollow Creek. The letter, now held in a private collection, contains a confession of sorts. I have not been entirely forthcoming in my official report regarding what we found at Hollow Creek. There are aspects of this matter that I believe should not become public knowledge for the preservation of order and the peace of mind of our citizens. However, I cannot in good conscience allow all record of these events to be lost, should they prove significant to future generations. When we arrived at the stone circle described in Deputy Hargrove's journal, I experienced something that defies rational explanation. As I stood at the edge of that circle, I heard a woman's voice speak my name, not aloud, but inside my mind, as clearly as if she stood beside me, whispering in my ear. The voice extended an invitation to step into the circle, promising that if I did so, I would understand what had happened to Marshall Thornton and the others. For a moment, just a moment, I was overcome by a desire to accept, so powerful that I took a step forward before I could stop myself. What prevented me was the sudden memory of something my grandmother once told me. A woman who came from the mountains of Tennessee and brought with her the old beliefs of those regions. She said, "Never accept an invitation to cross a threshold unless you know who's inviting you and what waits on the other side. Some doors, once passed through, can never be returned through." I ordered the posse to leave immediately, though I did not share what I had experienced. As we rode away, I looked back once and saw a woman standing in the center of the stone circle, tall, gray-eyed, watching our departure with neither disappointment nor anger, merely patience, as if she knew that sooner or later someone would accept her invitation. I have ordered that Hollow Creek be removed from all official maps and that the area be designated unsuitable for settlement. I cannot explain why without revealing matters that would strain credulity and potentially cause panic, but I believe this action is necessary for the public's safety. May God forgive me if I am wrong, and may He protect those who might venture there despite these precautions. The letter ends with a postscript that remains perhaps the most chilling element of the entire account. I dream of her now almost nightly, standing at the foot of my bed extending her hand, repeating her invitation. Sometimes I wake to the sound of singing outside my window, though when I look, there is never anyone there. I fear that in declining her invitation in person, I have somehow left a door ajar in my mind, allowing her to extend it again and again in my dreams. How long can one decline the same invitation before weakening? How many refusals before one fatal acceptance? I write this in what I fear may be my final days of true freedom, for I feel my resolve weakening with each passing night. If I should disappear, let this stand as explanation and warning. Mayor Bennett did indeed disappear in February of 1877. His horse was found on the road leading toward the former site of Hollow Creek, saddled but riderless. No trace of Bennett himself was ever discovered, and in the deepest parts of the Ozarks, on nights when the stars align in certain patterns, locals say you can still hear faint singing carried on the wind. A woman's voice using words from no known language, extending an invitation to any who might listen too closely, an invitation to join a journey from which there is no return.